Imagine sitting in a quiet family room when Tian Xiwei's grandfather suddenly turns toward Zhang Linghe and says something that makes everyone completely silent. If you refuse to quit acting for my granddaughter, then from now on, Tian Xiwei will be the only woman you ever act with. Zhang Linghe does not answer. Tian Xiwei freezes. Her grandfather remains completely serious. And suddenly, what started as a conversation about marriage becomes an unbelievable test of love, loyalty, career, and trust. But why would Tian Xiwei's grandfather make such a shocking demand? Why was he so determined to control the kind of acting career Zhang Linghe would have after marrying his granddaughter? And what would Zhang Linghe say when he realized that the grandfather was asking him to make a decision that could completely change his future? Before we reveal the moment that left Tian Xiwei speechless, make sure you stay until the end and tell me what you would do if you were Zhang Linghe. Would you quit acting completely for the person you love? Would you accept a condition that meant you could only act opposite one woman forever? Or would you refuse and explain that love should never require someone to give up their entire identity? Stay until the end, because the answer Zhang Linghe gives does not simply surprise Tian Xiwei. It forces her grandfather to reconsider everything he thought he knew about him. The evening had started peacefully. Tian Xiwei had invited Zhang Linghe to spend time with her family. There was laughter in the house. There were quiet conversations. There was the familiar warmth that came whenever everyone gathered together. But Tian Xiwei noticed that her grandfather was unusually quiet. He watched Zhang Linghe carefully. He listened to every answer. He paid attention to every small detail. At first, Tian Xiwei thought he was simply trying to understand the man who wanted to become part of her future. But she soon realized that her grandfather had already been thinking about something much bigger. Something he had not yet told anyone. Zhang Linghe was sitting across from him when the grandfather finally spoke. He asked Zhang Linghe how serious he was about Tian Xiwei. Zhang Linghe answered without hesitation. Very serious. Tian Xiwei smiled. But her grandfather did not. Instead, he asked another question. What happens when your career becomes more important than your relationship? The smile on Tian Xiwei's face disappeared. Zhang Linghe remained calm. He explained that his career was important, but it did not mean Tian Xiwei would ever become unimportant. Her grandfather listened. Then he asked about the nature of acting. He asked whether Zhang Linghe understood that his work would continue putting him around many actresses. He asked whether he understood that people would constantly watch him. He asked whether he understood that every performance could create new rumors. Zhang Linghe said he understood. The grandfather leaned back. He told Zhang Linghe that understanding something was not the same as experiencing it. He had watched fame change people's lives. He had watched public attention create pressure inside relationships. He had seen how quickly innocent situations could become complicated when strangers began making assumptions. And he did not want Tian Xiwei to spend her marriage constantly wondering about the people around her husband. Tian Xiwei tried to interrupt. She told her grandfather that she trusted Zhang Linghe. He looked at her and said that trust was important. But protecting someone you love was also important. Then he looked back at Zhang Linghe. That was when the conversation changed. The grandfather told Zhang Linghe that he had two choices. The first was to leave acting behind. The second was to continue acting, but if he chose that path, Tian Xiwei would become the only woman he would ever act alongside. The room became completely silent. Tian Xiwei stared at her grandfather. Zhang Linghe looked stunned. For several seconds, nobody said anything. It was such an unexpected demand that even Tian Xiwei could not immediately find the words to respond. She finally asked her grandfather why he would say something like that. He calmly explained that he wanted certainty. He knew he could not control the entire entertainment industry. He could not control the people who admired Zhang Linghe. He could not control every rumor. But he believed that if Zhang Linghe continued acting while only working opposite Tian Xiwei, there would be fewer reasons for her to worry. Tian Xiwei immediately shook her head. She told him that she did not need such protection. She said she trusted Zhang Linghe. Her grandfather replied that trust could be tested. Tian Xiwei became emotional. She told him that she did not want Zhang Linghe to change his career simply because her family was afraid. Zhang Linghe remained quiet. He knew that this conversation was not really about acting. It was about whether he could convince Tian Xiwei'S grandfather that he was capable of protecting the relationship without being controlled. The grandfather turned toward him. He asked Zhang Linghe whether he was willing to accept the condition. Zhang Linghe took a deep breath. Then, he asked one question. If I agree, will you finally trust me? The grandfather said that trust was something Zhang Linghe would have to earn. Zhang Linghe nodded. Then, he asked another question. What if Tian Xiwei herself does not want me to make that choice? The grandfather looked toward his granddaughter. For the first time, he seemed unsure. Tian Xiwei immediately answered. I do not want him to choose his career based on fear. The room became quiet again. Zhang Linghe looked at her. She continued. She said she did not want to be the reason he stopped working with other actors. She did not want to become a restriction on his career. She wanted him to continue pursuing his dreams. She wanted to support him. And most importantly, she wanted him to trust her enough to believe that she could handle the attention that came with loving someone famous. Her grandfather listened carefully, but he still had concerns. He asked Tian Xiwei what would happen when she became jealous. She smiled through her emotion. She said that jealousy was something they could talk about. He asked what would happen when rumors appeared. She said they would talk. He asked what would happen when Zhang Linghe had to travel for work. She said they would find a way. Her grandfather looked at Zhang Linghe. Then he asked what he would do if Tian Xiwei became insecure. Zhang Linghe answered immediately. He would listen. Not argue. Not dismiss her feelings. Not tell her that she was being unreasonable. He would listen. That answer caught the grandfather's attention. Zhang Linghe explained that he did not believe a strong relationship was built by controlling what another person could do. He believed it was built through communication. He said he could not promise that his career would never create difficult moments. He could not promise that nobody would ever misunderstand them. He could not promise that jealousy would never appear. But he could promise that Tian Xiwei would never have to face those moments alone. Tian Xiwei became emotional. Her grandfather remained silent. Then Zhang Linghe said something even more important. He told the grandfather that if Tian Xiwei ever asked him to stop acting, he would listen. But if the request came from fear rather than from Tian Xiwei herself, he hoped her grandfather would give them the opportunity to handle their relationship together. The grandfather looked at him for a long moment. He had expected Zhang Linghe to become defensive. He had expected him to argue. He had expected him to reject the condition immediately. Instead, Zhang Linghe had answered calmly. He had shown respect. He had acknowledged the concerns. But he had also defended the relationship. That was exactly what the grandfather had been watching for. The demand had been extreme. But perhaps the grandfather had never truly expected Zhang Linghe to accept it. Perhaps he wanted to see whether Zhang Linghe could remain calm under pressure. Perhaps he wanted to know whether Zhang Linghe would become angry when his career was questioned. Or perhaps he simply wanted to understand how serious Zhang Linghe really was. Tian Xiwei suddenly asked her grandfather something. What if Zhang Linghe chooses me but still continues acting? Her grandfather asked what she meant. She explained that love did not have to be proven by eliminating every possible problem. Sometimes love was proven by learning how to deal with problems together. Her grandfather became quiet. The room had changed. The conversation was no longer about an ultimatum. It was becoming a conversation about trust. Zhang Linghe then turned toward Tian Xiwei. He told her that he did not want her to feel responsible for any decision he made. He said that if he ever changed something in his career, he wanted it to be because they had discussed it together. Not because he was pressured. Not because he was afraid. Not because he wanted to prove himself. Tian Xiwei nodded. She understood. Then the grandfather asked the question nobody expected. If I refuse to give my blessing unless you accept my condition, what will you do? Zhang Linghe remained silent for a few seconds. Then he answered, I will respect your feelings. But I will not stop loving her. Tian Xiwei immediately became emotional. Her grandfather looked at him. Zhang Linghe continued. He said that he did not want to take Tian Xiwei away from her family. He wanted to become part of that family. He wanted her grandfather to trust him. But he also wanted that trust to come naturally. Not because he had surrendered everything. Not because he had accepted impossible restrictions, but because he had shown over time that he could be trusted. Those words affected the grandfather more than anything else that evening. He looked at Tian Xiwei. Then he looked at Zhang Linghe. Finally, he admitted that perhaps his fear had been controlling his judgment. He said that he had spent so much time imagining what could go wrong that he had forgotten to look at what was already going right. Tian Xiwei walked toward him. She took his hand. She told him that she understood why he was afraid. But she also asked him to trust the person he had raised. Her grandfather looked at her with emotion. He told her that protecting her had always been easier than trusting her, because protection allowed him to make decisions. Trust required him to let go. That sentence changed everything. Tian Xiwei hugged him. Zhang Linghe stood quietly nearby. The grandfather eventually turned toward him. He said that he still had one condition. Zhang Linghe looked at him carefully. The grandfather said that he did not have to quit acting. He did not have to promise to only act with Tian Xiwei. Instead, he wanted one promise. Whenever the entertainment world became difficult, Zhang Linghe had to remember that Tian Xiwei was not simply someone waiting for him at home. She was his partner. She deserved honesty. She deserved respect. And she deserved to know when something was affecting their relationship. Zhang Linghe agreed. The grandfather then smiled slightly. He said that perhaps he had been too strict. Everyone laughed. Tian Xiwei wiped away her tears. The grandfather told Zhang Linghe that he still did not like the idea of his granddaughter dealing with constant public attention. Zhang Linghe smiled and said that he understood. The grandfather then said that if Zhang Linghe ever made Tian Xiwei cry because of something he could have prevented, there would be another conversation. Everyone laughed again. The tension had finally disappeared. But the emotional meaning of the evening remained. The grandfather had started with a demand. Quit acting or only work with Tian Xiwei forever. But by the end, he realized that love could not be secured through restrictions. It had to be protected through trust. Tian Xiwei realized something too. She realized that her grandfather's fear came from love. He was not trying to destroy her relationship. He was trying to protect her from a world he believed could hurt her. Zhang Linghe also understood that becoming part of a family meant accepting that people would sometimes question his intentions. But he also understood that he did not have to surrender his dreams to prove his love. He simply had to show that his dreams and his relationship could coexist. The grandfather finally told both of them that marriage was not about finding a perfect person. It was about finding two people willing to communicate when things became difficult. He said that careers could change. Circumstances could change. Fame could change. But respect had to remain. Tian Xiwei smiled. Zhang Linghe nodded. And the three of them finally reached an understanding. There would be no demand that Zhang Linghe quit acting. There would be no requirement that Tian Xiwei become the only woman he could work with. Instead, there would be trust, communication, boundaries, and the promise that their relationship would always be treated as something worth protecting. As the evening came to an end, Zhang Linghe thanked Tian Xiwei's grandfather. He said that he understood why the man had challenged him. The grandfather replied that he had wanted to know whether Zhang Linghe would fight for Tian Xiwei without fighting against her family. Zhang Linghe smiled. He said that he would always choose the path that allowed him to love Tian Xiwei without taking her away from the people who loved her first. The grandfather smiled. For the first time that evening, there was complete peace in the room. Tian Xiwei looked at both men. The man who had protected her all her life, and the man who wanted to build a future with her. She realized that the real victory was not Zhang Linghe accepting the ultimatum. The real victory was everyone learning to trust one another. And perhaps that was the lesson her grandfather had been trying to teach all along. Love cannot survive on control alone. A relationship cannot grow if fear makes every decision. And a family cannot truly protect someone by refusing to let them choose their own future. Sometimes the strongest form of protection is trust. Sometimes the greatest proof of love is not giving up your dream. It is learning how to make room for another person inside that dream. And sometimes the most difficult choice is not choosing between love and career. It is choosing to believe that both can exist together. Tian Xiwei and Zhang Linghe left the room that night with a new understanding. Their future would not be perfect. There would still be challenges. There would still be attention. There would still be difficult conversations. But now they knew they could face those moments together. And Tian Xiwei'S grandfather had finally begun to believe that too. So the shocking ultimatum that began the evening became something completely different by the end. It became a test of trust, a test of patience, a test of love, and most importantly, a test of whether three people could learn to protect the same relationship without trying to control it. Now tell me what you would do if you were Zhang Linghe. Would you quit acting for the person you love? Would you accept the condition of only acting with her forever? Or would you respectfully tell her grandfather that love should be built on trust rather than restrictions? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you enjoyed the story, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for the next chapter. Because Tian Xiwei'S grandfather may have one final question for Zhang Linghe, and this time, the answer could determine whether he finally gives the relationship his complete blessing.